So welcome. It's great to see you.
Good to see you too.
Looking fabulous.
I mean,
Thank
really?
you. Yes.
I had
Wow.
no idea.
I just saw you at the Prabal Garang show, looking amazing.
I mean,
Yeah.
getting drenched, but yes.
Yeah, well, I was worried that you were going to be drenched on the way over. But clearly, all dry, so that's good. So today we're talking about queer futures, art, fashion, and identity. I wanted to start by thinking about, every day we wake up and we're thinking about what we're going to wear. And some people have a uniform that they wear every day. Maybe it's a khaki and a navy jacket. Other people have a different idea of what they want to wear to the day. And sometimes it's about wanting to project an image to the public. But you've made it very clear in a lot of essays and interviews that you've done that you really wanted to dress for you, and that the reaction you get is not the reason that you're dressing the way you dress. So this clearly had started in your teens. Today, for example, what were you thinking about when you were getting ready?
So this outfit appeared on my doorstep 30 minutes before I had to leave the house.
Okay.
So I was thinking, like, okay, let's go. Because I was
Okay.
just at a fashion show before this, so maybe today's not the best example of it. What I would say is that for me, clothing was my first practice of intimate sovereignty. I didn't really get a permission structure around the gender that I was assigned or the archipelago of racial stereotypes that I was assigned growing up in a small town in Texas. But clothing was where I first had permission to self-create and self-author. And so what I used to do is take my mom's clothes and my dad's clothes from the 80s mostly and put them together. It was the closest to getting along they ever had, my outfits.
Yeah.
And I would put together these outfits, and at the time, people would say, "What are you doing?" And I didn't really have a vocabulary for it, but then I realized the clothing was the vocabulary. What I was doing was saying, I'm figuring it out for myself. I'm figuring out who I want to be. And I think we live in a culture that requires us to have answers, but those are the most boring things. I think questions are way more exciting. And clothing allowed me to embody and live this question of who do I want to become? And so every day, if people were to look at me and say, that's who you are, I could change. And I think that's what's so beautiful and volatile about dress, is that it changes, it's unpredictable. You think that you know someone, and then the next day they can wear something completely different, and they interrupt any stable sense of identity. And so clothing, I think, has always been one of the most intimate architectures of the self I've ever had, because it allowed me fluidity and flexibility, where everything else seems so finite and rigid. And then as I've started to think more about dress and why I do it, I started to realize that often this word fabulous comes up. And at first I was kind of frustrated by it, because people would say, you're so fabulous, and I'd be like, what does that mean? And then now I have my working definition of fabulosity.
Oh.
My friend Madison Moore calls fabulosity and style political glitter that we can sprinkle across the world. And I build off of that to say, fabulosity is self-romance. We grow up in a culture that teaches us about how to find an ideal partner, but what about finding our ideal version of ourselves? And what if the greatest romantic arc of my life is me seeking that person? And fabulosity is me seeking that person, me seeking the zenith of who I could be. And like an asymptote, I think I'm always going to approach it and never reach it. But that's what's beautiful about fashion, is the potential for striving.
Fabulosity. So, love, political glitter. When you said those two words, it reminded me of someone from the 70s named Rollerina. Rollerina was a personality in New York City who worked on Wall Street, had been in the army, and wore roller skates to go to work every day. And one day, Rollerina was going through the East Village and stopped into a thrift shop and saw this dress and put it on and suddenly was roller skating in the dress down Fifth Avenue. Rollerina then started appearing at nightclubs, and Rollerina would walk in and she'd have a wand and do this and then sprinkle glitter on people.
Wow.
So Rollerina actually had a display at the New York Historical Society a year or two ago. And it was really, because we're talking a little bit too about institutions preserving queer history. And it was an opportunity for Rollerina to really talk about what it was like in the 70s and how they had just created this spontaneously. It wasn't a predestined idea. So I think that the idea of spontaneity is so important in our fashion choices every day. Yeah.
I mean, it can interrupt so much. When you show up to a funeral in a rainbow gown, it does something.
Absolutely.
It really defies a sense of choreography of what emotions belong where, of where the lines between public and personal, professional and non-professional, that one's the one that irritates me the most. And I think one of the things that I was so excited about speaking about this in the context of the Armory show was this idea of the work of art. I've been thinking a lot about what it means to the work of art, not just to be a work of art, but to do the work of art.
The work of art.
And fashion does the work of art in the public, and I think that's why it's so often absented from mainstream gallery recognition. There's been a kind of cleaving of fashion away from a lot of contemporary art, but I understand fashion as a really powerful modality of contemporary art. And when I say it's doing the work of art, what I mean is how many people are going to read Judith Butler and how many people are going to have their entire conception of gender imploded when I walk in a room? Fashion allows me to deliver that lecture and make it fun. Yikes. And so what fashion allows us to do is to bring the aesthetic questions that so much of the canvas work here does about what's possible, what is reality, and to actually bring it to where people are, wherever they are. And in that way, I think we're ambassadors of art when we wear fashion. We bring it into different places and we irritate so many people's conceptions of what is norm and what is real. And I was excited to speak to you because working in a art institution but doing the work of fashion, do you see people consider fashion as a legitimate mode of artistry, or do you see it just dismissed as a commercial project?
Well, it's a very tricky subject because, while people make art and they're going to think about selling it in a gallery, fashion is, in many instances, really connected with a business from the get-go. And a lot of couture, for example, wouldn't exist without the connection to a particular house and having access to a lot of different talented people who do beading or gilding or whatever it might be. So being a part of the system is also about having access, being able to accomplish these dreams that you want to put out on stage and have a conversation. I think back when you think about the 1940s, 50s, and you think about people like Dior, they were going in and making a collection and calling it the Zigzag Collection, the V Collection. It would have one theme to it. And then it got exaggerated when you got to the 1960s and 70s because people started doing all of these collections based on, today we would call cultural appropriation, although back then they would say it was an homage to Thailand or something. But today, we look at that and we say, oh, you can't do that. And we look at a collection today, and it'll be a lot of different things. It's not one style. So fashion today, whereas in the 1940s and 50s, you might have gone all head-to-toe Dior, Today, you're going to mix and match. You're going to be part Balenciaga, part thrift shop, part, you know, going down 34th Street and picking up something and putting it all together, and it's this kind of collage idea. So you do kind of make yourself into an artwork as you're going through.
But can we pick up on that idea? There's a way in which fashion is obviously commercial, but how is that different than any of the art in this gallery?
Exactly.
There's
yeah.
a way in which visual art performs itself as non-commercial, even though it's incumbent on the whims of the market, right? And in fact, many careers of visual artists are made by the barons of Wall Street. And yet that is seen as rigorous and creative self-exploration, not reliant on the market, but fashion isn't. And so I think that's where we have to pay attention to power. What gets seen as obviously commercial and what's not, and how does that have to do with democratizing the art form, right? Because yes, there's a story of fashion that begins with places like Dior and Chanel, but there's also a story of fashion that begins with Rollerina, that begins with everyday people taking the means of perception, not just production, and turning it against itself, self-glamorizing, right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking about a couple years ago when they had the Comme des Garçons show at the Met, and then at Barney's, they had windows that were looking at Louise Bourgeois' costumes that she made for performances in juxtaposition with Comme des Garçons. And you really see like two different versions of avant-garde dress, though one was made for artwork, one was made for commerce. And there is that blur between the two. I mean, I don't think that, you know, you can be the artist that just wants to make art and not concerned about your day-to-day budget. You know, I think about somebody like Jack Smith. You know, back in the 1960s, he's making films like Flaming Creatures. He's creating this kind of bohemian fantasy with veils and, you know, bringing in things from different cultures. And then Ron Vawter from the Wooster Group did a performance called Jack Smith, Roy Cohn, where it then was the two very different sides of being queer in New York. And so you have Jack Smith, who, you know, he didn't make money. He just was existing, you know, on film screenings. And then you had somebody like Roy Cohn, who's like charging, you know, how many hundreds of dollars an hour, you know, and being this terrible person. So you know, I don't know that we're ever going to separate, but I think that the idea of that every day we're creating a performance art is something that's very important in order to get people, you know, I don't know whether it's always agitation, you know, but you know, just think about like in the 70s or 80s when people like, I'm trying to think of the name of the model who started wearing sneakers with ball gowns. I mean, and it just, everybody was like, oh my God, how can you do that? But today, you know, you see so many women wearing, are you wearing sneakers?
No,
No.
I'm definitely not. I sometimes wish that I wear more of those things.
Oh, you're wearing platforms?
Yes.
Yes.
It's
Oh,
important to use your platform.
platform. Oh, they're great. Did you see Moon Age Daydream, the new documentary about
No.
David Bowie? So it has a scene in it where David Bowie's on the Dick Cavett show in the early 70s. He's full glam, and he has on platforms. And he looked at David and said, are those men's shoes, women's shoes, or bisexual shoes? And David replied, well, they're shoes, silly. You know, and Dick Cavett really wanted to be able to have the language to talk about the outfit, which he didn't feel like he had. And that was the question he could come up with. So, you know, we were talking a little bit too about, is fashion gendered? And you've worked on collections. I'd mentioned I thought we should talk a little bit about unisex fashion from the 60s and 70s, how it really hasn't, those looks, people thought that was the future. And it was really kind of a trend for a moment, and then it kind of disappeared. And the designers who were doing those works, like Pierre Cardin and Rudi Gernreich and Courrèges, occasionally those looks kind of get revived as a moment, but it didn't we didn't all become like Star Trek, and we're all wearing these very, minimalistic, avant-garde looks. When you're thinking about a fashion future, and having worked on collections, where do you see that going? Is something neutral or something that has more personality, I would say, to it?
I'm opposed to many things among the neutrality.
Okay.
I think it's important to always inform the future from the past, right? So we have to first interrogate the material conditions with which fashion became gendered.
Okay.
So it's important to remember that prior to the 19th century, of course, there's gendered and sex distinction in dress, but the more obvious distinctions were around religion and class and profession. A lot of what we now understand to be femininity is just more ornate wear, and people of all genders and sexes were wearing ornate wear. They were just bougie. And a lot of what we now see as feminine things like makeup or heels or wigs were actually worn by men. And that wasn't seen as an invalidation of their masculinity. It was actually a confirmation of a particular kind of masculinity. Mm-hmm. But then what we see in the beginning of the 19th century is a couple of factors, but fundamental among them is the organization of a lot of women's rights advocates advocating for the right to vote and the right to go to school. And this really challenged the fundamental paradigm of the sex binary at the time, which saw the private sphere, or at least the illusion of the private sphere, as a feminine domestic realm, and the public sphere as a masculine realm. And so this interrupted this idea of where women belonged in society. Mm-hmm. So there became a campaign to really re-entrench gendered and sex distinction in fashion as a way to reinforce the confinement of women to the quote-unquote domestic realm. So we'll begin to see that in this moment in history is an obvious exaggeration of the differences in women's and men's dress. So around the 1820s, you begin to see the suit become consolidated as the paradigm of masculine fashion. Inspiration for the suit came from Greek and Roman sculptures in terms of building back men's postures, making them look agentic, emphasizing their agency by having the literal defining of the legs, versus, in contradistinction, things like the crinoline that actually express an amorphous body that you can't ascertain underneath the clothes, with which men could project their fantasies of what women should be. So actually the gendering of fashion is deeply related to the political economy of sex and sexism. So the reason that the unisex movement in the 70s didn't really take the purchase because people are okay with dabbling with what they call metrosexuality. But the minute it begins to challenge the idea that there are only two discrete genders and sexes, and that actually we have more in common than dissimilar, that challenges the entire political superstructure of dividing the world into a gender binary. So what's interesting about the history of fashion and gender is that gender nonconformity is permissible in so much as it can be appropriated to still maintain a distinction between the sexes. But the minute that gendered fashion actually interrupts the logic of dividing two sexes, then it's too much and we have to reel back. So what we notice about contemporary displays of gender nonconformity is people are comfortable with it in the context of a stage, although that's changing with these anti-drag laws, comfortable with it within the context of a fashion campaign, but in all those moments it's seen as episodic and ephemeral, something that you're putting on just as for fun, but that's not who you really are.
Right.
But the minute it becomes about personhood, like when I'm wearing this off of this stage outside of the context of an art gallery, if I'm just getting on a train as one might, it becomes a problem or a crisis because it interrupts the very logics of the sex binary. So the issue is that the most vanilla, gray, unambitious forms of gender-free fashion are the ones that then surface as representative of what gender-free fashion looks like. I'm talking about formless, shapeless, gray, Star Trek inspired. I mean, yes, that can be chic. And a couture gown can also be gender neutral. People of all genders and sexes can wear that. Actually, a platform heel can also be gender neutral.
Yeah, thank you. There were you touched on so many things as you were talking. I was thinking about, you know, Chanel wearing the tuxedo in 1916, how that was radical at the time, how during the 1920s things were a lot more gender fluid. And, you know, recently I think that we've been looking at a lot more transgender models on the runways, that there's been a lot more effort put into representation across. And it wasn't something that has been a part of fashion for very long. I mean, you think about Warhol when he would have Candy Darling modeling, or you think about Terry Toy modeling for Steven Sprouse, and Connie Girl modeling for Terry Mugler. Connie Girl, we hung out a lot during the Terry Mugler show, and the journey that people go on to find who they are and how to make the transition from the person they were to the person that they want to be. You know, Connie talked so much about, you know, working in the East Village at various clubs and talking about, you know, her feelings about who she wanted to be. And she said, you know, somebody finally said to her, well, you can. And that moment where it was like, it wasn't that she needed a permission, but for somebody to say it was possible made all the difference. And so Connie was then able to go on this journey of becoming the person that Connie really wanted to be. And so I think when we're then thinking about the visions that we're putting out on a runway and to have people involved, like, you know, Connie was in the H&M runway show when they had the H&M Mugler. I mean, how fabulous was that? And, you know, she like stole the runway when she walked out. Just amazing. But a big part of it is makeup, as you mentioned. You know, a few years ago, I remember Jean-Paul Gaultier had brought out a collection of men's makeup. And I remember walking through Macy's many times, and this display was there. It was eyeliner, it was a concealer, something. And it sat there. I don't know how many people actually bought it. But makeup, you know, we talked a little bit about makeup a couple weeks ago. You know, makeup is an area that has been in vogue, out of vogue. You know, are you going to wear eyeliner or are you not? And there have been different art movements, different fashion movements where it has included men's makeup as a part of the look. I love what you're doing. Do you want to talk a little bit about?
Yeah. Let's just add to the list of things I can't. Men's makeup. All makeup is already gender neutral. That's just a capitalist marketing ploy of taking the exact same products and calling them men's so insecure men can feel comfortable putting on concealer.
Yes.
When plot twist, they're already putting on concealer.
Yes.
And that actually there's this illusion that men aren't spending money in the beauty industry, which is completely wrong. But in the same ways in which fashion gets marked as commercial, beauty gets marked as gendered, and that's a contestation of power. That actually all of us are participating in beauty culture. It's just because of patriarchy, there's a stigma associated by men who are open about it. So men's makeup actually concedes to the dominant grammar of patriarchy. I think that what we need is not just more trans models, more gender-neutral collections, more gender-neutral makeup, but the degendering of fashion beauty writ large. So that looks like the abolishment of Men's Fashion Week, Women's Fashion Week, the abolishment of men's makeup, women's makeup, and actually just giving fucking makeup, okay? It's not that hard, but the reason it's hard, once again, is that political investment in the gender binary, which is so funny because these people say that it is permanent, biological, and yet the millions of dollars they have to spend in reviving the dead corpse of it continually.
Yes.
Actually, there's nothing fixed or permanent about it. It's constantly being produced and constantly being invested in. We're investing in the fiction that there are only two genders and that these genders are oppositional. And so when people like me appear in public, we have to be eliminated, and it's not just about us. It's in order to maintain the collective fantasy that there's only two options for everybody. So the reframe that I've been trying to really push in my artistic career is don't show up because you pity the violence that I experience as a trans and non-binary person. Show up because you understand that the gender binary is also harming you. It just looks different. The gender binary is making it so that men can't be publicly beautiful. What a tragedy that is. Yikes. That would help us all. So what I really want to say about makeup is not only is makeup for everyone, but makeup actually has a queer history as well. Both when it comes to fashion and makeup, queer people in so many ways are architects of contemporary beauty trends. But then what happens is that our aesthetic genius makes it onto the Vogue cover, but not our actual embodiment. So when we're thinking about things like contouring or thinking about things like color correcting, these are actually technologies that emerge in this country specifically from drag and performance arts. Actually, the term makeup is a theater term.
Yeah.
And it actually begins with contemporary, or with historic theater figures, people like Julian Eltinge, who was a renowned female impersonator who actually had an entire theater named after himself in New York City. With the dawn of cosmetics, actually a lot of respectable middle-class white women would subscribe to beauty tutorials from female impersonators. Because with the invention of the camera, they became self-conscious that their face would be encountered by people who would never meet them in person. So they began to be very conspicuous about their face. Who did they rely on? The genius of stage performers who understood how to use makeup as a technology of light, as a technology of re-shifting perception. So then what happens is that makeup becomes cosmetics when it becomes generalized to a middle-class white audience, but previously to be called a painted lady was a slur for sex workers. Makeup was seen as a lowbrow technology associated with working-class people who were soliciting sex. So what I think is really important whenever we talk about the future, we have to account for the grievances of the past. That LGBTQ people have always been fundamental to stories and narratives of beauty and fashion. It's just that our visible embodiment challenges the ruse, the fiction of the gender binary, so we have to be disappeared. It's so obviously irritating to me. I mean, oftentimes I'm invited to speak, and then people misgender me on stage, and I'm like, okay, so this is exactly staging the type of politics that I'm speaking about. What you want is my aesthetics. What you don't want is my humanity. What you want is to look at me. What you don't want is to listen to me. What you want is to objectify me. What you don't want is to see me as a subject and as a peer. So what's needed, I think, when it comes to both makeup and fashion and the future of queerness is actually humanize us. Don't just see us as another makeup device to use to make yourself more glamorous or a stylist to hire to make yourself more desirable. See us as legitimate human beings. And it feels like that's an increasingly controversial political opinion, that people like me are human beings.
Well, yes, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Very, very human. Very human. I feel like I have to have a pause after that. That was so great. You were talking also going on about makeup. You know, I was thinking about people like Wei Bandy, for example, in the 1970s, who did all of the makeup for Scavullo, for example. And when you do look at the history of makeup with people like Max Factor and their inventions of makeup, it really, you know, they often would try it out on themselves as they were working through it. And there really has been this long history of men working in the makeup industry behind the scenes, often uncredited, and also people that work in other industries like florists. You know, there's been so many great florists. Beautiful shoe designers.
My favorite thing is when you start talking about florists.
Oh, florists.
Yes, tell us more about florists.
Florists, you know, when you look at horticulture or you look at the whole history of flowers.
So gay.
It's so gay, right? You know, or even men that would wear a boutonniere or a corsage. You know, there was a certain time where only certain men would wear a flower, and I remember having an experience when I was little. My grandfather, Sicilian grandfather, he saw that I was growing carnations in the backyard of our house, and I had had these very pink carnations bloom, and he went over with a scissor and he cut them and he put them in his pocket and walked away. And I was so devastated that he cut my flowers. But then later I was so like, wow, Grandpa Dominic's wearing pink carnations, which had always been a very gendered color. And we were talking a year or two later, and he talked to me, I think I always look best in a pink shirt. And I think, flowers, the beauty of flowers, the colors, they're the same names of colors that we have for makeup, that we have for paint. And also, paint itself. If you're a portrait painter, a lot of the techniques that you're using to paint portraits are very similar to what makeup artists are doing. And actually, the pigments in makeup and the pigments in paint are very similar. And so I think that there is a lot of background that's going on, that gay men are creating these beautiful visions for the world to see, anonymous oftentimes. But this is how people have been able to participate in the world, by creating these beautiful visions, but again, it's anonymous.
Yeah, and I think it's also important that some of these people were trans as well, not just gay men. And some of these people actually, I think about the work of Dr. Sarah Elspeth, who has an amazing book called Work, A Queer History of Fashion. I think about George Chauncey's amazing work on gay New York in the early 1900s of New York. A lot of these people were fairies, what we would now understand to be gender nonconforming people or non-binary people. In fact, they experienced persecution within the, quote, gay community because they were blamed that the reason that there was homophobic oppression was because they dressed too weird. And in fact, even though we now commemorate Stonewall as the inception of the contemporary gay rights movement, a lot of the Stonewall queens were dismissed as flamboyant, screaming queens by gay men themselves.
Yes.
So there's always been an underbelly of the gay community that actually was visibly flamboyant and gender nonconforming, and I think we have to be specific about that language, because that anonymity was also superimposed by masculine gay men as a way of saying, don't draw attention to us. In fact, there's a very interesting history to the word queer. The word queer became used by masculine gay men as a way to differentiate themselves from gender nonconforming fairies. The idea was if we just looked masculine and if we just looked straight, then we would get progress and acceptance. Now it's interesting that queer has been understood as a radical signifier, as departure from contemporary gay politics, when actually in its genesis and origin, when it's first used, it's used in a transmisogynist way. And I think what we're seeing is the aftermaths of those political decisions. So often people describe and account for the contemporary violence against trans and non-binary people like me as just a phenomenon of the extremist and radicalization of straight cis culture. But can we talk about the radicalization of gay male culture? Can we talk about how so many gay men have internalized the idea that it's our comportment, how we dress, what we look like, that should be whether we experience violence, not that the onus should be on the perpetrator of violence. So how much of queer life, how much of queer artistry, how much of queer expression would there be if we didn't internalize this idea that our violence and our safety should be incumbent on our appearance? And I'm trying to decouple that. And I think a lot of the work I'm trying to do with fashion and beauty and art is to say, why is this only permissible when I'm on a stage? Because the stage has begun to feel like a cage. It's not fair that I can only dress like this and feel safe whenever I'm a spectacle for people. It's not fair that people just see this as a costume that I put on, that I'm just here to entertain people. It's not fair that we have been so essential and integral to the development of fashion, beauty, and art, and then yet these very industries are silent when there are almost 600 pieces of legislation trying to criminalize us out of its existence. It's not fair when people think that that's a political thing, when they don't think it's political to profit and traffic in queer aesthetics without caring about our lives. That's the real politics.
Yeah, wow. Yes, thank you. As I was thinking about today, I was thinking about that problem a lot, about how a lot of the times, people like Bowie or performers you think of from the 80s, you think about Boy George, you think about Annie Lennox, Grace Jones, and their personas were really either on a stage or in the box of the television. And it didn't extend out. And I was thinking about that in relationship to an interview that I read about on Friday, where you were talking about this very problem. And I hope you don't feel like you're in a cage right now.
There's good circulation of air. I'll hold it.
But it is that transition from being on stage and performing and being what, a character versus being able to take the person and be out in the world and for that to be okay. I was reading about your incident that you had in 2016 in Melbourne, and I was thinking about an incident that I'd had in college once where I'd had on this kind of long, black, flowy kind of outfit and was attacked on the street from these two guys.
I'm sorry that happened.
Yeah, and these things are awful when they happen, and you just you think, how can I go on? How can I keep being the person I am? And, you do have that moment about, as a gay person, whether you can be who you want to be out on the street. And I think that's why a lot of us all arrive in New York City, because it's a place that celebrates art and culture and being who you want to be, versus growing up in Texas or Pennsylvania or, God help you, Florida right now, where there is so much legislation that's saying that, if you want to wear a gown to a library and read fairy tales to children, that, oh my God, that might be a bad thing. Yet, all of the fairy tales themselves are, they're very embracing of personality. It's like Walt Disney. You think about all the characters that they've created at Walt Disney. And then it was a big deal like a year ago because they had a character that was openly gay. But you go back and look at the history of Walt Disney. I mean,
Ursula being based off of Divine.
Oh my God, Divine. I mean, we could spend all day talking about Divine. I went to the opening of Hairspray, and Divine was there with John Waters at the opening. And Divine, I'd seen all of their movies, but Divine arrived at the opening in these gigantic diamond studs in his ear and a floor-length black Glamour mink coat. And it was such a look, and something kind of embedded in my mind forever. Anyway, Divine.
Like horticulture, detours are so gay.
Yeah, they are. But one of the people that used to design for Divine actually was a man named Larry Legaspi. And Larry Legaspi was most famous because he designed the outfits for Kiss and LaBelle, especially. Remember when LaBelle
Wait,
had
you're saying the same
outfit?
designer that designed the outfits for Kiss designed Divine's outfits?
Correct.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's important to know.
Larry Legaspi, he had a store on Bleecker Street. It was called Moonstone. And you'd go in, and he did all the trapunto stitched outfits. But I thought it was very interesting that, Beyonce, of course, has absorbed a lot of gay culture in this new Renaissance tour, and everybody's wearing silver to go to her concert, because that's what she asked people to do. And I thought, Well, but you're not the first one to do that. You know, LaBelle, when they played at the Metropolitan Opera on a Monday, they had asked everybody to wear silver in 1975.
Everyone needs a fashion archivist in their lives because the amount of archival shade that you're throwing right now is very impressive.
It's my job. Not to throw shade, but to do the history. You know, a lot of times it's hard because people always want to say, "Oh, I did it first," or "You did it first." You know, you didn't, and you know, and chances are, you know, you just need to do a little bit more research, and you're going to discover that there's likely some great gay guy back there doing all these wonderful things.
Some screaming queen.
Some screaming queen, yeah. Where would we be without, we wouldn't have anything to wear without screaming queen.
Oh my goodness, that's the takeaway.
Yeah.
Have you thanked your local screaming queen today?
Oh my God, yeah. No, you should thank them every morning. Bow down. Okay, I'm just checking time. Okay. We also need to talk about a little bit about the future. That's our title of the queer future.
Allegedly, yes.
Yes, allegedly. So we talked a little bit about past futures, people thinking about what would be the future tomorrow. And we've talked a little bit about, you know, the fact that we should be able to walk into Macy's and Bloomingdale's and the makeup counters should be degendered, that it shouldn't just be images of women in beautiful makeup. Why not everybody being represented in the makeup display? Or even fragrance. Why does fragrance have to be gendered? I mean, it just, you know, I remember back in history, back in the 1950s, there was that moment where Liberace had gotten in lots of trouble because he'd gone and bought perfume. And the tabloids had written about that he had bought it for himself. And so...
Once again, like, men smelling better is a common issue for all people. Like, so that's the thing is, like, when I'm talking about degender in fashion and beauty, I am doing a courtesy to the patriarchy. With climate apocalypse impending, wearing a fucking skirt in the summer is just the best option.
Yeah.
Why are you still wearing a suit? You smell rank. Put on some perfume, you know?
Yeah,
you look tired. Here is a skincare routine. It helps everyone. People don't want to be beautiful. That's what it boils down to.
Oh, yeah, you know, it's a decision to be beautiful, right? You know, I mean, you know, when I was thinking about being here with you today, I was like, well, you know, I can't compete, so I'm gonna just
No
like...
competition.
No competition.
Beauty is not a scarce resource.
Yeah. That's a great line. Beauty is not a scarce resource. That could be a great T-shirt. But T-shirts are actually great gender neutral.
That was the
clothing.
best detour of the night. That was so good. Yes, T-shirts are.
Yeah.
There was a real moment with the invention of the T-shirt where people were having this thing of like, we're democratizing the sexes. This is equality. This is great. Now, form-fitting T-shirts are seen as more feminine.
Yes.
Loose-fitting is seen as more masculine. Notice how all of the interventions to gendered logics in fashion then get rewritten back into the binary.
Yes.
It's obnoxious. We're seeing it with nail polish. We're seeing men's nail polish.
Right.
Like it's really concerning. There's this idea, and I think when we're talking about the future, we have to think about the past always, because we are the past, present, and future at the same time. That's always been my conception of time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really important to understand why American empire is so invested in the fiction of two genders. What's really important to understand is that the progenitors of American empire looked at Greek and Roman empire, and they said, these were meant to be the greatest civilizations on earth. But they failed because why? They allowed for queerness. And they said, unlike those ancient empires of the past, American empire will win because we will have no space for queerness. So in fact, some of the first eugenicists began to describe queer and trans white people as racial atavists. Atavists was a pseudoscientific term that they used to say that these white people were not racially evolved enough to become straight. They understood being queer as a form of racial disability that had to be corrected through various methods like lobotomies, conversion therapy,
Terrible.
medical castration,
Yep.
and fixed so that they could reproduce the race. In fact, a lot of people, Herbert Spencer's, etc., would understand white queer people as quote-unquote traitors to the race, right?
Yes.
So actually, the insistence on the gender binary has always been about racism in this context. And that's what's really important to name, is that right now, the groundswell of anti-trans legislation is a direct backlash to racial justice. Those things often don't get paired together, but they're really important to understand.
Yes.
Is that actually in this country, there's always been a focus on the white family, a focus on retaliating against the sincere and just demands of Black and Indigenous and other racialized people for equity, with saying, no, absolutely not. This poses a threat to our existence. People thought of it as fear of race suicide, the idea that white people are going to become a demographic minority. The fear there is if white people become a demographic minority, the same violences that they enacted on other racial minorities will lasso back into them.
Yes.
So the reason that people are so hell-bent on maintaining the fiction of two genders has everything to do with racial supremacy in this country. So we can learn from the past to inform the future is that we need racial justice first and foremost.
Yes.
And that a lot of these conversations that are had around the future of gender is non-binary, the future of gender is free, I'm like, yes, and let's also really acknowledge that that is a future for whiteness, because for many indigenous cultures, for many people of color, and for many racialized people, we've already been here. We've already been gender-free. Yeah. We've already been understanding that gender is an illusion and a colonial ruse. So I always ask, new to whom? And future for whom? And I think that's what's really important going into this next election cycle, going into this next political landscape, is like, what we're seeing is that right-wing forces are trying to censor history, to make salacious and horrific claims that institutions like slavery were to the benefit of Black people, or that indigenous genocide wasn't as bad as we say that it was. Why is that? It's because when you don't teach people these histories, then you're able to naturalize the status quo as how it's always been. You're able to take your specific political choices and see them as absolute biological truisms, and not as actually the result of domination. It's not democracy, it's domination. So what we need going forward actually is to learn from the history to inform the future. And when I study, deep study, about how gender, fashion, artistry came to be, the reoccurring theme always is colonialism and coloniality. And so what I want is for us not to colonize the future. I want a future that is anti-colonial. And what a future that's anti-colonial looks like is getting a damn good fashion archivist who can remind us someone did this before.
Oh, thank you so much. That was great. Thank you very much. I think we have some, I can't top that. We have some questions. Any questions? No, we have one here, yeah.
Thank you both so much. This is amazing to hear. It's not so much a question as I just wanted to hear a little bit more about flowers as flagging. Yes. If that was something you could share a little more about. Thank you.
Oh. Tell them about horticulture.
Oh, flowers. You know, one of the great things about flowers is that they're also the sex organs of plants. And I think...
And that, by the way, most plants are intersex.
Yes, they can. Yes, they can be intersexed. Most flowers. You know, and I say that because I was thinking about the other day about Robert Mapplethorpe's photographs of flowers, and sometimes those photographs of Robert Mapplethorpe are a great gateway for a lot of people who don't want to necessarily admit that they like Mapplethorpe or they're interested in his full body of work, but they can say, oh, the flower photographs, they're beautiful, you know, and they are, you know. And so flowers have a way of being able to bring you into conversations just because of their natural beauty and because it's nature. It's like, we could talk about, fur coats or something and have an opinion about fur coat, whether you're pro-fur or anti-fur. But it's because it's nature, it's somehow okay for everybody to talk about, So flowers, yeah, I could talk about flowers for days. We should do a panel on flowers.
Manifest it, yeah.
Yes. Okay, anything else? We have 1 minute or one question. Yeah, in the back.
Thank you, Matthew and Alok, for wonderful conversation. My name is Andres. I'm from Medellin, and I live between Medellin and Brooklyn. And I know, Alok, you just went on a series of talks throughout Latin America. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on this theme of queer futurism from your experience in the region.
I had the time of my life in Medellin, so great to meet you. And I want to shout out an amazing queer collective there named the Pluma Collective, who taught me that pluma is often used as a slur for queer people because it's a way of saying you're so flamboyant that's being reclaimed. And they put together one of the largest queer festivals in Colombia recently, a couple of months ago. So that was really thrilling. And, I feel like one of the best benefits of growing up in Texas in a place where people feel like it's just homogeneously conservative is that I've had to interrogate how the law doesn't necessarily translate into the life of queer people. That actually on every nook and cranny of this earth, there are queer people making glorious, beautiful, fecund, ripe life. And I feel like so often in the global north, we look at countries in South America as just homogeneously homophobic or transphobic, or the presence and lingering presences of Catholic supremacy and indigenous genocide and dispossession. But the other story that's being told is some of the most vociferous and fabulous queer activism that the world has to learn from. And so I think we all really have to do our due diligence to challenge superficial narratives that dismiss places like Florida, like Texas, like Colombia, like Brazil, as just bastions of homophobic and transphobic violence, and really try to connect with queer and trans artists, activists, thinkers there. I felt really transformed by my experiences touring in South America because so many of my art agents in the US would say things like, there's just not a market down there. And then you go and it's like, that's so not true. And I think that stages a larger question of who do we see as a market for art? And why do we continue to rehash this idea that there's a particular demographic that's invested in the questions that we're raising in our art, when in fact everyone is the market for art? And especially in times like this, where people keep on turning to political commentators who use words like ignorance, maybe it's time to listen to the artists who never use a word like ignorance, who actually remind us that people self-sabotage because that allows them to create predictable outcomes, that people actually are making decisions based off of emotional information, and no amount of data is going to change someone's mind. Maybe a good story will, or maybe an image that's so compelling it penetrates beyond logic well, or maybe a movie that is so captivating it takes what people thought was finite and absolute and reveals it to be in flux. So I just think it's time to invest in artists. And I think that's going to be the point that I make on every stage when people ask me, Alok, what do we do? Like, things are so bad. I'm like, invest in artists, and invest in artists in places that you don't think that there are artists. Invest in those artists because they're the people creating the work that will and can change the world. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.